In this video, I want to show you the one thing every strategy needs to cover, no matter where you are, what kind of company you operate, what size, what market you're in. Every strategy needs to cover this one thing. And I think it's actually the most important thing strategies should actually tackle. I am talking about identity. You see, when I start a strategy formulation session, I always give the group my definition of strategy. It's not meant to be better or worse than however they might define strategy, but in a formulation, in a facilitation session, when you have a group together, it is helpful to have one single strategy or one single definition that everyone can align to, so we're speaking the same language. Now, my definition of strategy is that strategy is about figuring out who you should be as an organization. I'll say that again. Strategy is about figuring out who you should be as an organization. The who, an identity. That really defines everything you do. Let me show you exactly what I mean by that. Hi there, my name is Ruben Ugarte, and I'm an expert in strategy and decision making. I have worked with 90 plus organizations, helping them formulate exciting and bold strategies that allow them to create their future. In my contention in this video, as you'll see, is the most important element of a strategy is determining who you should be as an organization. What should be the identity of your company going forward? You may have an identity right now, of course, but what should it be in the future? What are you trying to move towards? Now, this is a little bit different from perhaps what other strategies look at, where they might focus very heavily on the factors or the areas, the critical issues, the accountabilities, how to monitor strategy, potential issues. And I cover those too in the formulation. But the identity, to me, is the most critical piece, because how you see yourself as an organization, and of course, an organization is full of people. So we're really talking about how the people see the organization. It really determines a lot of different decisions. It effectively creates a container under which you make decisions. So let me give you an example. Let's make this a little bit more tangible. So let me turn here to my iPad. Let's look at how identity really affects how an organization operates from a strategic perspective, right? Let's look at Sears. Now, Sears used to be very big, maybe about 40, 50 years ago. And Sears is an old organization. And it really went through what I consider at least two major identity shifts in its history, and it failed to do a third one. So let's see what I'm referring to. So the first identity shift that Sears made was really back in 1889. At that point, the founders, Richard Sears and Alva Roebuck, they came together. They started this mail order firm, and they realized a couple things that became quite essential. First, farmers were an underserved market, and at this point in time in the U.S., farmers were a significant market. There were quite a lot of people who actually worked in farming, and they lived in rural towns. So they realized, first, that farmers are actually valuable customers. But how do you reach them, right? And this is where they came up with the catalog, right? They created the famous catalog. That catalog, within a few years had about 300 pages. It reached about 523 pages at its max, and sold everything from watches, clothes, and even cars actually were sold through this catalog. So they put this catalog and they put them on railroads, right? So the railroad system was quite extensive in the US. So they put the catalogs in the railroads, they reached the farmers, and the farmers would order from the catalog, and the products would be delivered to them. In essence, in this first identity shift, who the organization needed to be, they were really, in the distribution business. This is what we call the identity. they became really good at delivering things by railroad, all the way to all the farmers, and trying to figure out what their needs are. So that's how Sears saw themselves at that point in time. That led them to have the first major retail IPO in American history in 1906. And it is said that farmers used to have two books in their houses at this point in time. They had the Bible and they had the Sears catalog. So very, very successful. Now things change. Let's fast forward a little bit. And Sears made an identity shift here, a pivot, around, let's say, the 1920s. In 1925, Sears opened its first store. And there were a few changes happening in American society that they noticed, and they realigned their identity to tackle it. Once again, first, we have cities. So we have the Great Depression, and what we're seeing is this great shift from rural towns to urban centers. Many of the people who worked in farming now became workers. Farming itself became much more efficient. Today, of course, the farming population in any country is really quite small to what it used to be. So you had this massive migration to the cities, to urban centers. After World War II, you had an increase in car ownership. So now people could drive different places. So even if you live in a city, you could drive, an hour or two. That became really crucial as Sears started to open a lot of stores, not really in the core of the cities, but just around it, that were really quite friendly for cars. Their stores were some of the first to cater to men and women. We'll put here consumer demand, especially, after World War II, there was this increase in consumer demand and need to buy things. So Sears now made an identity shift to retail. They were now in the retail business. This is who they were as an organization. They still, of course, had the mail catalog, which actually, ran until early 90s. I think 1992 was when they actually discontinued the catalog. They still had the catalog. They still had some deliveries, through railroads, but now they were in the retail business. So they had retail stores, and they built around that. And they made all these decisions around what it means to have a retail store, to offer great service in a retail store in this era, right? 1920s, 40s, 50s, and so on. This is really an identity shift that lasted until the 70s, which we can call sort of the pinnacle, the climax of the Sears empire. And then we had a third point in time where Sears did not make the shift. And this is what really led to the decline. So now we're in the 80s. In the 80s, Sears really started to lose focus. They did a lot of things that were not actually aligned with retail. For example, fun fact, they were actually the company that released the Discover card. One of the sort of the 4 or 5 major credit cards today. So they did that. They had financial products. They had some investments in other things, right? They discontinued the catalog in 92. By 2010, they were no longer profitable. Today, 2023, as I'm recording this, there's only 11 stores remaining for the entire Sears, company. And here, what happened, as we see eventually, we saw a rise of a few things. First, of course, we saw Amazon, coming up in the 90s. And we also saw Walmart, right? When you think about this sort of retail business from the 20s and 30s and 40s, it sounds very much like what Walmart is today. But here is where I would argue that Sears never made the next identity shift that they had to do, right? They needed either to become e-commerce, which is what Amazon is, or low prices and great service, which is what Walmart is. They had many of the elements. I mean, if you think about what e-commerce is, it's a fundamentally logistically heavy business. And what's more logistically heavy than putting things on railroads and sending it across the country? They had the retail stores, just like Walmart did, in many of the urban centers and areas, many quite big, most likely even bigger than many Walmarts. But they never made the shift, right? And this is why figuring out who you should be as an organization is so important. You can do all kinds of things. I mean, Sears was doing all kinds of strategies and tactics focus areas, priorities, accountabilities, monitoring, financial tweaks, but they never fundamentally made this shift right here. They never updated who they should be as an organization. Are they really just in the retail business, or are they in some kind of low-cost, great service business like Walmart? Or are they, part of the next internet era, right? They did not morph into that. They lacked that jump. A jump they did previously well from distribution to retail. So we go back here. Strategy is about figuring out who you should be as an organization, right? Now we see that answering this question in the past could be sort of good enough for many years. I mean, this is 1880s. That was good for maybe about 30 years. And then, this is the 1920s, 30s. That was good for another 30 years until the 70s. I would think that today organizations have to do it a lot quicker. Probably not every year, but every 5 years, 10 years, this question has to be rethought and make tweaks to make sure you're still operating as who you should be, right? And we find plenty of examples of organizations who did not make the shift. The Blockbusters of the world, the BlackBerries, right? But this is fundamental to every strategy, right? Now, in the future video, I want to talk about how you actually make the shift. What are some of the things you look for? So stay tuned for that. But I want to just leave this idea with you, right? So think about your strategy, think about your company, and look back and say, are you really operating in the way that's congruent with who you should be instead of who you are, or who you're being forced to become, right? We can find different distinctions here. There needs to be a very deliberate approach to determining your identity in the future and then move the entire sort of strategic ship in that direction. Perfect. That's all I have for today. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, like, and comment. In the description box below, you'll find a few links. There's my newsletter and Substack, which has similar ideas once a week. Highly recommend you check it out, and it's free. There's my website for other resources, and of course, my YouTube channel has other things. Until next time, talk soon.